Blackledger presents the document that flips the story. Not a press release, not a headline. One early stamped piece of paper, distributed before the shipping assets deteriorated, made the later roll-up look engineered, not accidental. Here's the question you should be asking. What single early shipping company document made the private equity roll-up look less like a strategy and more like an engineered outcome? In the next 7 minutes, I'll show you the clause and the money trail that created the intent gap. Then I'll cross-check how later filings appear to fit what that first document set in motion. Let's start with the first document. The earliest paperwork I'm talking about is not the first time an investor mentioned shipping. It's the first internal acquisition and capital structure memo attached to the initial buy and build package. In deal language, it typically looks like an investment rationale and acquisition term sheet exhibit, circulated with a financing package, often inside a private placement memorandum or lender deck. It's the kind of document that comes before asset deterioration, before restructuring stories become public. And crucially, it's where the decision logic lives. Target criteria, funding assumptions, and what happens when the numbers wobble. Now imagine it under spotlight. Date, redactions, a receipt stamp, a version number, then the first red flag, a line that reads like a forecast, not a hope. The tell is usually buried in what the memo calls eligibility requirements, specific acquisition characteristics paired with a downside case. For example, the memo language often combines two elements. First, it defines eligible targets using criteria like consistent cash generation, charter coverage metrics, vessel age ranges, or counterparty quality. Second, and this is the part that triggers controlled outrage, it explicitly ties those eligibility criteria to a planned financing structure. It assumes funding through a holding company or SPV, and it maps how cash flows will be swept or trapped through covenants. When you see that pairing in the earliest memo, the question changes from, did they spot opportunity, to did they plan the outcome? What makes this the single pivot document is the way it frames deterioration. The memo doesn't just buy ships, it buys a mechanism, the expectation that some portion of the portfolio will degrade into a predictable restructuring path while remaining deniable as market cycles. Look for a clause that effectively says the deal can proceed even if utilization drops, because the financing is structured to withstand stress. In other words, it builds in the ability to keep purchasing or keep servicing while ships underperform. The clause is often titled something like financing assumptions, downside protection, cash waterfall, or covenant headroom. And what you're really seeing is a pre-planned dependency. The roll-up is designed to outlast trouble. Now let's map the money trail in plain terms. This is where the document stops being rhetoric and becomes a ledger. The simplified flow is usually like this. An upper-level holdco or fund vehicle receives equity from investors. That equity funds an SPV. The SPV contributes to acquisition subsidiaries that hold vessels or operating entities. Then cash flows from charter revenues move upward under a cash waterfall, often described in that same early memo. Payments typically look like operating costs first, then vessel-level obligations, then debt service, then management fees, then distributions. But the engineered outcome appears in the order and the escape hatches. If the earliest memo sets covenants that allow certain payments to continue even during stress, while limiting creditors' ability to force corrective actions, distress stops being random. It becomes part of the design. Here's the key. That first memo gives you the sequence before you see the deterioration. That's why critics say it happened because the market turned. But what this document implies is different. It implies the investors weren't merely reacting. They were pre-positioning capital so that deterioration, when it came, would trigger the same playbook every time. This is the intent gap. Critics claim coincidence and opportunism. That memo implies engineered repeatability, because it tells you what happens to cash when conditions worsen and which payments still survive. Then later filings start looking like they're catching up. Cross-checking subsequent documents is where the story tightens. After the first memo, you typically see later acquisition disclosures, periodic lender reporting, and restructuring communications. In those later papers, the language often rhymes with the earlier targets and covenants. For example, If the first document says acquisitions focus on specific vessel characteristics, like certain charter contract types or counterparty profiles, you'll notice later filings repeatedly describing those characteristics as justification. And if the memo anticipated covenant headroom, the later disclosures tend to describe covenant maintenance actions, extensions, amendments, waivers that conveniently align with what the memo said would be feasible. The later paperwork doesn't contradict the memo, it appears to confirm it. That's how the engineered outcome narrative gets teeth. So what's the mechanism? How can an outcome feel predictable while being framed as deniable? It comes down to incentives, fees, and covenant structure. In many roll-ups, management or sponsor entities earn fees based on assets under management, transaction value, or ongoing portfolio operations. If fees are upstream through a waterfall that remains intact during stress, or if the documents allow partial payments before distributions are suspended, then distress can be monetized. Meanwhile, covenants can be structured so that default is delayed or negotiated. That gives time, and time is the currency of roll-ups. The first memo effectively tells you that time can be purchased because the structure is built to keep the machine running when the market misbehaves. That's how market cycle becomes a cover for timeline engineering. Who benefits when the roll-up mechanism meets deterioration? The documents usually show investors benefiting through returns driven by capital recycling and fee streams. Sponsors benefit via transaction fees, management fees, and potential success-based economics, depending on how the deal is drafted. Creditors may benefit initially from asset backing and charter revenues, but the covenant and waterfall design determines who bears the later pressure. And this is where the paper trail matters. If the earliest memo explicitly planned for downside scenarios, yet later filings claim surprise, then liability expands. Not necessarily in the simplistic sense of they knew everything, but in the legally relevant sense of what they represented, what they assumed, and what they designed. Even without naming individuals, the document constrains intent, because it's the first time the structure is justified with assumptions, and those assumptions become a benchmark. If later reality diverges, that divergence must be explained. Finally, here's the takeaway. The reason this single early shipping company document is the pivot point isn't because it mentions shipping. It's because it links three things together before deterioration: target criteria, financing assumptions, and a cash flow waterfall with covenants. When those elements appear in the first stamped acquisition rationale, before the ships start failing, the roll-up narrative reframes. From smart investors found undervalued assets, to they designed a repeatable outcome where distress could be managed in their favor. That's the moment the story changes from coincidence to intent. So here's your CTA. If you want part 2, I'll break down the exact clause category, eligible acquisition characteristics, financing assumptions, and covenant headroom, and I'll show you what to look for line by line in the next document you encounter. Because once you know the tell, you can read intent into the structure.